Hello there, and welcome to our special coverage about the Russia-Ukraine file, coming to you live on All 24 News with me, Karim Fazak. Russian forces in Ukraine apparently have shifted their focus from a ground offensive aimed at the capital Kiev to instead prioritizing what Moscow calls liberation of the contested Donbas region, suggesting a new phase of the war. It appears too early to know where this will lead. The President Vladimir Putin scaled back his ambitions in search of a way out of the war, apparently. The dug-in defensive positions taken recently by some Russian forces near Kiev indicate a recognition of the surprisingly stout Ukrainian resistance. With the recent events, NATO, new membership, Russia expelled diplomats, new wave of sanctions, countries' refusal of the new set of sanctions, and US warning to China only lead to escalating the war? Is Ukraine being sacrificed so far as long as this operation continues? All this and more will be analyzed today in our special coverage by our panel of guests. I am joined live via Skype by Dr. Itumuleng Makgetla, an independent political analyst from Bloemfontein, and Dr. Deniz Berktay, a Turkish journalist in Ukraine and an expert on Eastern Europe from Ukraine. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. The discussion right after this break. And before we delve into any discussion, let me share with you this info. In his evening speech, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of creating a bloodbath in eastern Donbas region, warning of the difficulty of the coming weeks, since Ukraine has suffered more than 3,000 airstrikes in less than 3 months.
The most difficult combat situation now is in the Donbas, Bakhmut, Popasnaya and Severodonetsk. In this direction, the occupiers concentrate the greatest activity at this time. They stage a massacre there and are trying to destroy all life. Literally, no one has destroyed the Donbas the way the Russian military is doing it now.
Let me start with you, Dr. Deniz Berktay. Russia has shifted most of the focus of its war to eastern Ukraine after pulling back its forces from near the capital Kiev. The battle for Ukraine's old industrial heartland, known as Donbas, is likely to decide the fate of the Russian invasion. What would Vladimir Putin need before he could claim success after a campaign beset by failure? Did NATO provoke Russia's incursion into Ukraine by violating its commitments, according to you, or is there another motive? Deniz Berktay, you can hear me?
Hi, yes. Yes, I hear you. On your questions, first of all, yes, I think that NATO or the United States and the United Kingdom, they provoked Russia on this question. I don't say that Russia was completely good. Russia acted in a reliable way. I don't say this, but of course, Russia had ambitions on Ukraine, but the United States and the United Kingdom, they provoked Russia on this question, and they all the time said that NATO should expand in eastward direction. NATO, and that Ukraine should be a member of NATO. Although, for example, the former ambassador of the United States to Moscow, Mark Paul, admitted the day before yesterday that the United States cheated Ukraine on the question that Ukraine could become a member of NATO. In other words, although they didn't believe and they didn't wish to make Ukraine a member of NATO, they all the time made such a propaganda. They provoked the local population that Ukraine should be a member of NATO. In this situation, they provoked Russia as well, although they had no serious intention to integrate Ukraine to NATO completely. First of all, Secondly, Putin, in order to claim a victory in Ukraine, Putin, first of all, needs to establish full control in the whole Donbas region, because before the war, 2/3 of the Donbas region of Ukraine was under the government control, while 1/3 was under the occupation of pro-Russian separatist forces. Now, Putin has to gain full control of the Donbas region, but most of all, he needs to hear that Ukraine will become a neutral state. This is one of the most important priorities of Putin.
Thank you indeed. Now, let me turn to you, Mr. Itumelang Makgatla. When President Putin talks of Donbass, he is referring to Ukraine's old coal and steel producing area. What he really means is the entirety of two big eastern regions, Luhansk and Donetsk, which run from outside Mariupol in the south all the way to the northern border. What do you think that President Putin wants to control in Donbass? And what do you think is Putin's strategy? Mr. Makgatla?
Yes. I think the whole situation that is happening with the advancements of the Russian troops is really just unprecedented in terms of how we've been looking at this war since it began. The advancement of the Russian soldiers, it was initially thought to be a done deal, because even in its nomenclature of the time, it was said to be a military operation. But we find that it has not been a thing that it was said to be. It is a full-scale war that is advancing and is not making any signs of retreating. Therefore, I think Putin is probably thinking that if he does abate and take a little bit of a stance that is looking as if he is retreating from the war, he will suffer embarrassment, even more deepening the faction within his own party. Therefore, Putin is also just as in trouble as the Ukrainians. Zelensky can, in fact, he said that he put up a good fight, but we can see that the morale on the Russian side has not been giving us much of a sight that the Russians are really, many of their soldiers, willing to be there and wanting to be there. Therefore, this war can go either way. It is really still early to call.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed. Moving on now, in the first day of World Economic Forum in Davos, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called for more financial support, including a complete halt of trade with Russia, 3 months after the start of the conflict. Let's follow this report and we get back to the discussion.
Come to the annual meeting 2022.
The founder of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Klaus Schwab, officially opened its 2022 edition placed under the sign of solidarity with Ukraine. President Zelensky, the guest of honor, did not hesitate to ask for more weapons to Kyiv and maximum sanctions against Moscow in a video call speech, 3 months after the start of the Russian adventure in Ukraine. Ukrainian president called also for faster international aid.
The faster the aid to the attacked country is provided, the more value it has. Arms, funding, political support to us, and sanctions against Russia. That's what the sanctions should look like. They should be maximum, so that Russia and any other potential aggressor who wishes to wage a brutal war against its neighbor knows exactly what it leads to.
The first day of the World Economic Forum witnessed the participation of Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Ahmed Al Thani, who criticized harshly the discrimination Qatar has been subjected to, affirming that some cannot accept the idea of an Arab and Muslim country hosting and organizing the 2022 Football World Cup.
Tamim bin Ahmed Al Thani.
For decades now, the Middle East has suffered from discrimination. And I have found out that such discrimination is largely based on people not knowing us and in some cases refusing to get to know us. Even today, there are still people who cannot accept the idea that an Arab Muslim country would host a tournament like the World Cup. These individuals, including many in positions of influence, have launched attacks at a pace never seen before when a mega sporting event was hosted by other countries on different continents.
The founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, welcomed a particularly strong delegation of Ukraine, but on the other hand, excluded this year the Russians, who usually represent a large number of participants. The Ukrainian delegation has also transformed the house usually used by the Russian delegation into a Russian war crimes house, where an exhibition of photos of victims and damage caused by the conflict was inaugurated on Monday.
Mr. Denis Baktay, analysts suggest an increase in the use of other energy sources such as wind and power when we're talking about Europe and trying to find an alternative to Russian gas and oil. But doing so is not going to be as quick or as easy. Do you think this would save Europe after Russia halted gas on nations and forced unfriendly countries to pay in rubles? Noting that consumers will face rising energy and fuel bills. Heating prices, for example, are likely to increase. I mean, even more if Russia restricts gas exports to Europe. So definitely an alternative is a must. What do you think, Mr. Baktay?
Well, of course, Europe should seek ways to decrease its dependence on the Russian gas, and they are seeking. And some European countries have already refused using Russian gas. So this is such a process, I think.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Magetla, when we talk about the Economic World Forum, we speak about the impact of the war on the world as a whole. Where you're standing, can you tell us how you feel the impact of the war? What would be the bigger repercussion on all African countries in general? Hello? Apparently, we lost him. Mr. Benes, maybe you can answer the question. Can you give us more insights as to the repercussions of the war on the world in general, Mr. Dennis?
Well, we can say that now the war continues, and today is exactly the third month of the war. You know, the active phase of the war. I say the active phase because the war, as the Ukrainian officials say, the war between Russia and Ukraine continues since 2014. Just as when Russia annexed Crimea and when pro-Russian separatist forces claimed independence in Donbas region in 2014. Since then, the war continues, but the active phase of the war began 24th of February, and today is the 24th of May. But as the war continues, and nobody had predicted such a long war, and so as the war continues, some Western states, some European states are beginning to get tired. There's such a term, tiredness of Ukraine. There was such a term in politics. So Russia also expects that as the war continues, this might split the Western world.
And we see that the impact is on food prices. We see the impact on many fuel, let's say, products prices as well. And this is not going to stop here. And we see in the Economic World Forum, Ukraine pleading for more financial support. How much costly is this war going to be on the world? It's not just Ukraine here.
Well, you emphasized an important point. For example, the well-known American diplomat and academic Henry Kissinger even made a conversation that he urged the Western states not to provoke this war anymore. He even, furthermore, he urged Ukraine to give some territories to Russia. I don't think that this is a good point, this is a good view, but the speech of Henry Kissinger also shows that a real split in the Western world has begun. And Russia also expects this. And there's also one important point. Russia has blocked the Ukrainian ports. So, Ukraine cannot export grain to the other countries. And Russia, as a precondition of unblocking the Ukrainian parts, they say that the Western countries should remove the sanctions against Russia. So Russia still has some advantages in this war.
Thank you indeed. Moving on now, Michael Anthony McFaul, a former U.S. ambassador to Russia, claimed that Washington has been lying to Ukraine about its NATO bid since 2021. During the Monk debates, that is, at Harvard, foreign affairs expert Stephen Walt emphasized that the U.S. was urging Ukraine to join NATO into 2021. Despite Russia's misgivings about the defined alliance's eastward expansion. Walt emphasized Moscow's long-standing hostility to NATO expansion, which he claims threatens Russia's regional security. Back to you, Mr. Makgetla Itomelang, the ambassador that served in office from 2012 to 2014, claimed that diplomats in Washington have been lying all the time about NATO membership of Ukraine, dismissing the threat to Russian security. Why do you think that the U.S. would lie to Ukraine? What is its purpose behind this act? Apparently, we're facing technical problems with Mr. Makgetla. Mr. Dennis, if you heard the question, would you please respond, or you want me to paraphrase the question?
No. I understand you. And it was especially the issue which I mentioned at the beginning of the program. You remember, I also mentioned that the former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, Mark Paul, said that the West has been cheating Ukraine on the question of NATO membership. But why they are doing so? To this question, I can say that the Western countries, especially the United States and Britain, they are trying to keep Ukraine under their control. But they don't want to integrate Ukraine, because in case of a full integration to NATO, or for example, for Germany and France, they also don't want to integrate Ukraine to the European Union, because in case of full integration, they will also have to give something to Ukraine. But without this, they are just now exploiting the pro-Western feelings in Ukraine, because in the ruling elite in Ukraine, there are pro-Western sentiments. And when they say, yes, you are doing well, congratulations, you will be soon a member of NATO, you will be a member of the European Union, in this way, they are trying to keep Ukraine under their control and out of the Russian influence.
And in such case scenario, can we say that Ukraine now has turned into a proxy war?
A proxy war with Russia, you say?
Yes.
Ukraine had been in a kind of proxy war since 2014. Because the Ukrainians used to say that since 2014 until February 24th, Ukraine was a kind of hybrid war with Russia. But now, instead of that war, Ukraine is now in a hot war, in a direct war with Russia in this situation. But a kind of proxy war, if you mean between the West and Russia, yes, this is also, when I look at the events in Ukraine, I all the time emphasize that there are two cases in this war. First of all, this is a war between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia is an aggressive state. But at the same time, this is also a proxy war between Russia and the West. And in this situation, both sides try to establish their own influences on Ukraine. And Ukraine is just like a place, is a war place. And Ukraine suffers from this war, from this proxy war between the West and Russia.
Very nice indeed. Dr. Imetlang Makgatla, if you're with us, Russian arguments against NATO expansion have revolved around two assertions. Firstly, that the entry of former Warsaw Pact member states into NATO has violated a pledge given by the alliance earlier not to spread eastward. And secondly, that the West has sought to drag Ukraine into NATO. But is there any truth to these claims? Mr. Makgatla, you with me?
Perhaps we need to begin with the fact that the expansion of NATO has really also been one of the main reasons why this war began with in the first place. We saw in 2012, if I remember correctly, that when the Crimean War, the threat to go into Crimea by Russia was actually also instigated by the expansion of NATO into what Russia deems as its territorial space. Therefore, of course, those politics of NATO expansion are deeply unsettling on Russia's territory, and this war is just a means of people not being able to communicate and resorting to the last resort because there's two sides speaking across each other. Therefore, I think NATO needs to also take seriously the grievances of Russia for them to come to the table and realize that what they are advancing into, it is not within the interest of the Russian government at all. And also, if we bring in China into the fray as well, that will always be some issue about the encroachment and the encirclement of certain territories by the United States and its allies NATO. Therefore, it's not only just a one-sided thing, but it is also a two-way traffic.
Thank you indeed. Moving on, National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden said earlier that the United States is confident that Sweden and Finland will have an effective procedure for joining NATO and that Turkey's concerns can be addressed.
We're confident that at the end of the day, Finland and Sweden will have an effective and efficient accession process, that Turkey's concerns can be addressed. Finland and Sweden are working directly with Turkey to do this, but we're also talking to the Turks to try to help facilitate. The United States is prepared to send a very clear message, as are all of our European allies, that we will not tolerate any aggression against Finland or Sweden during this process.
The United States strongly supports Sweden's application for NATO membership. Our two militaries routinely exercise together. Your capabilities are modern, relevant, and significant. And your addition to the alliance will make us all better at defending ourselves.
Back to you, Mr. Denis Paktay. President Vladimir Putin said earlier that Swedish and Finnish NATO membership didn't pose a threat to Russia, but cautioned that Moscow would respond if the alliance boosted military infrastructure in the two countries. Murmansk region near Finland is packed with nuclear weapons and military facilities from the Russian side. That is, a NATO-backed surprise attack on Russia could derail the supply chains between Moscow and Murmansk. How do you think Moscow will deal with this effort or this threat?
Well, Moscow needs to recheck its foreign policy approaches because Russia, all the time in foreign policy, they apply to threats. They don't want to. They don't try to convince in. They don't want to convince in other ways, but they all the time say that if any country becomes a member of NATO, then there will be very harsh consequences, etc. And as a result, they push those neutral states to the camp of their enemies. And in this situation, for example, when Russia attacked Ukraine in February, this just increased the supporters of NATO in Finland and Sweden. After that, the Russian Foreign Ministry tried to threaten those states, Sweden and Finland, but it also caused another reaction. And since they didn't have any means that could change the situation in the near future, then they changed their tone and by saying that membership of Sweden and Finland in NATO does not pose a direct threat to Russia. However, I think that especially the membership of Finland in NATO, the probable membership, because they haven't become a member yet, but the probable membership of Finland in NATO will pose a direct threat to Russia. Why? Because of two reasons. First of all, the border between Russia and Finland is 1,200 kilometers, a very long border. And in this situation, Russia will have to allocate huge forces at this border. Secondly, the second biggest city of Russia and the main port city of Russia, St. Petersburg, is located just 150 kilometers of the Finnish border. And in this situation, the membership of Finland in NATO will completely isolate Russia from the West. So, of course, they will take some precautions, despite the fact that they say that this doesn't pose a direct threat to Russia.
Thank you indeed. Dr. McGetla, do you think that Russia will suffer from having access to warm water, since Moscow always faced difficulties in the Gulf of Finland, and thus reaching to the Baltic Sea would pose actually a difficulty if the NATO expands? What do you think? Mr. McGetla, can you hear me?
Generally, by judging at the number of companies that are moving out of Russia, the major Western retailers and service providers that are boycotting the war and moving out of Russia as a sign of protest against the war, and particularly against the Russian government itself, is telling of what is to come for Moscow itself. If now, for instance, that movement gets a sway to pull out of Russia more, Russia will definitely hemorrhage. It will lose a lot of money, a lot of investment, and a lot of its infrastructure will be affected, that's for sure. We've seen that the Western companies that have been going out, the likes of Starbucks, McDonald's, to name a few, it's just a tip of the iceberg of what the situation their own people are facing. Therefore, it is not as if Moscow has got nothing to lose at it. So, in as much as the NATO expansion is something to fight for them in their perspective, they also having to suffer with lots of incursions to their own well-being. I think that we need to just wait and see as to if the two factions or the two interlocutors can sit down around the table and find a common way, because it is both of them that are suffering, and also the world as large, as the professor has kindly alluded to above.
Yes, indeed. Now, let me share with you, Dr. Denis Bakhti, this info, and I want you to give me your point of view about it. U.S. President Joe Biden says the United States would defend Taiwan militarily if Beijing invaded the self-governing island, as described by the U.S. leader.
Look, here's the situation. We agree with a one China policy. We've signed on to it, and all the attendant agreements made from there. But the idea that it can be taken by force, just taken by force, is just not appropriate. It will dislocate the entire region and be another action similar to what happened in Ukraine.
Mr. Denis Bakhti, briefly, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine approaches its third month now, concerns over how Western allies will react if China or Chinese companies try to assist Moscow in invading or evading sanctions imposed by the US and UK and Europe in general. How do you analyze this, and how do we read the threats, or the direct actually threats of Joe Biden to China?
Well, there are a few points in this situation. First of all, you asked how the West will react, but the West in this question, as we see, is not unified. There is not a unified West in this situation, because on the one hand, there are the United States and the United Kingdom, and on the other hand, the other Western countries who are not directly concerned about this war. For example, like France, etc. And in this situation, first of all, the United States had already threatened China that in case of support of Russia in this war, it would have consequences. In case of support of Russia against the sanctions, it would have consequences on China, and China had granted that it wouldn't support Russia to get over those sanctions. But if we look at the situation in general, there are 2 points in China's foreign policy. There might be a few priorities. On the one hand, despite everything, now the biggest trade partner of Ukraine is the People's Republic of China. It might sound strange, but it's a reality because China has benefited from the animosity between Russia and Ukraine and between Russia and the West, and it silently became the biggest trade partner of Ukraine. But on the other hand, a collapse of Putin's regime will not be beneficial for China because the biggest threat for China is, of course, the United States. For this reason, China will, in some ways, support Russia, I think.
Thank you so much. And thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Our debate comes to a close. Bye for now.